Welcome everyone. It's so nice to have you here for our live virtual gallery talk today. And I'm so excited because I've got three of the most brilliant colleagues that I've got at the museum joining forces to give you a really spectacular look at the art museum collection, but in a really unique way. So we have David Barry, who's the Assistant Director of Academic Affairs and Special Projects. We have Megan Salazar Walsh, who is our Assistant Conservator at the museum. And we have Kai Sacco, who is the Rose Garden horticulturalist. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the three of them. So thank you all so much for doing this. And participants, you're in for a real treat. So I'll stop talking now and mute myself.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to all our guests. Thank you for your support as members, and thank you for your participation in the program today. I think we may reintroduce ourselves real quickly before we kind of lay out the scope of our tour today and begin with our first object, just to give you a sense of the different perspectives that the three of us bring to the subject. As Laura mentioned, I'm the Associate Director for Academic Affairs and Special Projects. My job these days is heavily administrative, but my background is as a historian or art historian. And one of my areas of interest is natural history and the history of natural history. And that is what has sort of informed our topic today. But I don't have the background in the sciences, but I am fortunate to work with colleagues that do have scientific backgrounds, Megan and Kai, who are here, and I will leave it to them to introduce themselves and give you a sense of what their background is and the perspective that they will bring to our topic today. Megan?
Yeah, I'm Megan Salazar Walsh. I'm the Assistant Conservator at the Ringling. And I am a paintings conservator, so I take care of the paintings collection mainly, all of the collection really, but mainly the paintings. And my area of interest and sort of the expertise, to call it something, that I'm bringing to the table today is really artist materials and historic artist materials specifically.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Kai Sacco. I'm the Rose Garden horticulturist. My background is actually in biology, but specifically environmental science. So I've done a lot of research regarding mangrove ecosystems, frogs, amphibians. So I have a real passion for ecology and nature with a background in science.
Thank you. I think I have shared my screen. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. One of the benefits in doing this virtually is we can weave in to the slides that feature objects in the Ringling's collection, sort of supplemental materials from other collections to help greater contextualize the works that we're focused on today. The theme that we're looking at, and this is fitting for April 22nd, it being Earth Day, so nature as a subject is quite appropriate. Our theme is, this is really a naturalist's guide to the Ringling collection. As Laura mentioned, it's looking at the collection through a different lens. But we've titled it Animal, Vegetable, Mineral, really just sort of to have a little bit of fun. That phrase, these words and the phrase, probably rings a bell. And one of the reasons is that this is kind of an antiquated and certainly heavily simplified way of dividing up the parts of the natural world. But it is also the name of a Victorian parlor game that really was the precursor to 20 Questions. So for a tour that is designed to ask questions of the collection and hopefully ask questions of you as participants, we figured that this was a good way to contextualize it and set things out. Our goal today is to really approach works in the Ringling Art Collection from two different perspectives. One is to look at nature as subject, as represented in works of art, but also to look at nature as material, so the material out of which a work of art would be made. And it's quite fun to kind of step back and consider works of art, many of which are going to be familiar to you from a very, very different perspective. So the first work that we've chosen to highlight, for those of you that are familiar with the collection, is probably an obvious one, but what we're looking to say about it may be a little less obvious. This is the German painter and printmaker Lucas Cranach the Elder. This is his portrait of Cardinal Albrecht of Brandenburg, featured here as Saint Jerome from the 1520s. Before we get into the particulars of this, Megan is going to give you her take on this from a very particular perspective.
So if you were gonna guess animal, mineral, or vegetable, and it's not a trick question here, what would you guess? We are gonna talk about animals, but we're going to first talk about the animals that are used to make the artwork before we get into the animals that are actually depicted. And specifically, I'm gonna talk about animal glue. So animal glue is a really, really common, really ubiquitous material in art making all throughout history. And it's really durable and a really strong adhesive, actually. It's made out of animal parts, usually the hides, but also tendons and bones, and sometimes even hooves and other parts, cartilage, all the bits that we sort of don't eat. And those bits of animal are saponified to get rid of any fatty acids, and then they're washed with acid to get rid of mucus. Tasty, yes, I know. And then they're kind of cooked at a very controlled temperature for an extended period of time that helps to break down the proteins. And eventually it is cooled and dried, and you get a dry material, which is the animal glue that you actually would preserve and use, and that's later dissolved in warm water in order to apply it as an adhesive. So in this painting in particular, it is used in several ways, beginning with the actual construction of the panel support. This is an oil painting on panel, and it's a pretty good size panel. So it's not a single cut of wood, it's actually several wooden panels that are adhered together, and they are adhered with animal glue. The panel is then prepared again with animal glue as a sizing. So it would be a very dilute animal glue that's brushed onto the bare wooden surface. And that helps keep, it creates a barrier between the paint media and the wood, which actually helps keep the wood from degrading long term. So it actually really helps preserve that wooden panel. And the same thing goes on canvas paintings, that they're sized as well with an animal glue, and it helps keep the acids from oil paint, for example, from breaking down the fibers in the canvas. So once you have that dilute glue sizing on the surface, the artist would be applying a layer of gesso for traditional panel painting preparations. And gesso is essentially, again, animal glue with some sort of whiting mixed into it. So either a chalk or a gypsum, or maybe even a kaolin. And that's applied in several layers and sanded really, really smooth. And it gives a really beautiful, smooth, bright white surface to then apply your paint to. And then last but not least, the frame would also have animal glue in it. And this frame in particular, in the corner joins, there's probably animal glue there used to help maintain those joints together. It's not just a mechanical join. So I think now David's gonna talk a little bit about the animals that are actually depicted in the artwork. David?
Thank you. Yes, so from nature as material, we go to nature as subject, and this painting is a perfect example in which to kind of address that theme. This is a Roman Catholic cardinal, Cardinal Albrecht, who was a great rival to the Protestant reformer Martin Luther, who happened to be, interestingly, a friend of the artist, Cranach. He is depicted in his private study or studiolo in the guise of Saint Jerome, the great church father, great scholar, which is appropriate again based on the setting in the private study. But Saint Jerome is credited with having translated the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into Latin. So an important historical figure that the cardinal is trying to draw an association to. There's a reason for this, and the animals play a part in this, in that he was known to have a somewhat dubious character. So the animals are there to reflect, from his perspective, the better parts of his identity. They are there to represent strong and sort of noble qualities of industriousness or loyalty, fidelity, et cetera, et cetera. The animals are there serving in a kind of emblematic way. They are symbolic of these different traits. And we're going to explore a little bit where that connection comes from. Before we get back to the painting, I wanted to show you a couple things. This is a sketch by Cranach of a dead hind. This is a female deer, probably red deer, and it shows a beautifully rendered a drawing here of an animal from life, or more accurately in this case, from death. This is probably the spoil of a hunt, and this would have been a case in which the artist would have had access to a wild animal. And you can see the extraordinary level of detail based on direct observation. The animals featured in the painting reflect Cranach's knowledge of the natural world, but they read very differently. They read, as I mentioned, sort of more emblematically, as if they're there to represent something else more than they are to represent their species. I should mention, for many, many years, this particular work was actually attributed to the great German master Albrecht Dürer, a contemporary of Cranach, but it has been reattributed to Cranach, and there are numerous examples of the red deer in Cranach's work. But Dürer is hugely important to our story, because Dürer is one of those great artists of this period that turned to nature as a source of inspiration and produced some of the most exquisite and most beautifully detailed drawings of plants and animals drawn from the natural world. In the case of the animals in the painting, when Cranach didn't have access to the thing itself, in the case of the deer, there were other sources that he could go to for inspiration, and some of those sources are represented here. This is a page from what is referred to as a bestiary. This is a wonderful medieval illuminated manuscript dating from around 1200. These were hugely popular in England and in France in the late Middle Ages, and they are heavily illustrated with pictures of animals that accompany stories about the animals, really as a way of conveying moral lessons about human society more than it is a natural history of the animals with an interest on animal, say, character or habit. The animals are there, again, to serve an emblematic role. Their story tells us something about ourselves. But these works become mined for imagery of animals throughout the later Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. Another source that Cranach could have looked to would have been something like this, a pattern book that scribes would have had in studios, or artists would have had in their studios. The easiest way to think about this is sort of medieval and Renaissance clip art. It is a ready reference source for what things look like. This is a piece that is almost exactly contemporary with Cranach, this Tudor pattern book at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And these two pages represent a lion, a dragon, a griffin, and a greyhound, animals that are heavily used in medieval heraldry, as well as in architecture and in other media. So there were sources of visual images that Cranach could have looked to kind of inform the representation of some of the work of the animals in his painting. You can see, interestingly enough, on the left there, a red deer, beautifully rendered, but in this case, it's the beaver that I want to draw your attention to. We can see it, we can recognize it, because there's enough accuracy there to communicate the message, but it does look more sort of, again, emblematic, less a piece drawn from art and more probably drawn from an existing source of imagery. The kind of thing that Cranach might have looked to would have been these printed sources. This one actually is a little bit later, but it is the foremost work of natural history of the Renaissance, produced by a near contemporary of Cranach. This is the Swiss physician and naturalist Conrad Gessner, and this is one of 5 volumes of his History of Animals from the middle part of the 16th century. This becomes the most popular book of natural history in the Renaissance. And part of what informed it, the interest on the part of the public, was the fact that it was heavily illustrated. Some of the illustrations are more accurate than that of the beaver here, and would have been drawn from life, but a lot of them are pulling from existing sources of imagery. The same types of sources that Cranach would have been looking to himself to inform his work. So we have the beaver here as represented in this great work of natural history. Here again is Cranach's lion. The sort of sneaky looking lion ready to pounce is one that Cranach features in a number of his paintings. We recognize it, there's enough accuracy to know what it is, but it's certainly not a lion drawn from life. And we can see the related example here in Gessner's Natural History. It is sources like this, or from sources like this, that the scholars of this period would have derived the majority of their knowledge about the natural world, and the same would have been true for artists. What's interesting about these is that it isn't just scientific knowledge as we would define it today. It includes information about the role of animals in history, in folklore, in legend, as well as in the visual arts. It's a kind of compendium of all knowledge about animals, and it was a great source of information and inspiration for artists of the Renaissance and beyond. Another feature of Cranach's portrait of Cardinal Albrecht is this wonderful lamp made out of antler that hangs above the cardinal in the painting. The figure here is a sort of Cupid-like figure holding on to a coat of arms. As many of you are aware, if we were in the gallery looking at the painting in place, hanging above it is this wonderful lamp in the form not of a Cupid-like figure, but a mermaid. German lamp from the middle of the 17th century, again made of antler and carved and painted wood. This was acquired by the museum's first director, Chick Austin, really to enliven the portrait of Cranach, to bring a piece of it to life. It's kind of an element of theater, if you want to think about it in those terms. But it is the mermaid that I wanted to draw attention to here, because the work of Gessner and others was not limited to animals truly derived from nature. The jury was sort of still out at this time on whether there were such things as mermaids or sea monsters. So they were indeed included in the first great work of natural history. The belief in creatures of this sort continues on well beyond the date of publication of the book. There is a specimen of a mermaid that was featured in the founding collection of the British Museum in the middle of the 18th century. And as many of you may know, P.T. Barnum at his great American Museum on Broadway in New York in the middle of the 19th century featured the Fiji mermaid, one of his most celebrated hoaxes. So there is a long, proud tradition of representations of sea monsters, and we can see the connection in the gallery at the Ringling. Anybody have any questions so far? All right. Well, if questions arise, feel free to ask them as we move forward. The next work that we thought we would focus on is this wonderful collaborative piece by the great Flemish master Peter Paul Rubens and his contemporary Rubens Barrett of Pausias, the ancient Greek painter, and his beloved Glycera, who is known for producing these, or really celebrated for producing these beautiful wreaths made of flowers. Laura, I have trouble reading comments while looking at the screen, so if there are questions.
Yeah, so we did just get a question about the previous painting. Why is the perspective so off? And the previous painting?
I'm not sure. I think part of it is the kind of flattening helps to sort of elongate the view. so that we are able to sort of see deeper into the studio, because the whole thing has sort of been pitched forward. So there may be a practical explanation for that. I don't know whether there's also a sort of a historical one as well, based on the kind of understanding and mastery of perspective as it was at the period. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? I would think, at least on some level, what it allows you to do is to see more, because there's less in the way of foreshortening. The animals and the furnishings are not stacked one in front of the other, making it harder to read that the parts of the painting in the emblematic way we were describing, because they've been pitched up. You can sort of read them individually, as opposed to how they would exist if they were kind of receding on a single plane into space.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's definitely a stylistic choice. It's, yeah, intentional, I would say.
Right. So with the painting that we're looking at here, this is an interesting collaborative piece. Rubens was responsible for the figures, and Barrett, celebrated flower painting, a painter for the flowers growing at the bottom and in the basket in the vase off to the right. Before we come back to the painting, wanted to talk very, very briefly about Barrett and flower painting. One of the great celebrated flower painters of the 17th century. Barrett had a deep and intimate knowledge of the natural world, the botanical world, and his works, this is another example at the Dallas Museum of Art, reflect very much that knowledge, as well as his the technical mastery that is represented here. What's interesting about flower painting as it relates to botanical illustration, which we'll talk about in just a second, is the process as well as the goal and objective. I think one could argue in general that the goal and objective of a piece like this is to be a beautiful picture of beautiful things, despite the fact that it is based on a detailed knowledge of the subject matter. But it's less about the identification of the particular plants directed towards a scientific end, and it's more about the beauty of the flowers as rendered here in a work of art. Barrett had, as we talked about, detailed knowledge of the botanical world, and what you're looking at here in the case of the individual flowers are really sort of composites based on studies of particular plants, but they, as represented here, become more generalized. It's not likely that he had composed this ensemble and then painted it verbatim. He is applying his knowledge of the different flower forms to a new composition based on studies that had been produced over time. Kai, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, so as someone from kind of a non-art history background, in doing research about Barrett and his paintings, something I found really interesting was he tended to put flowers that bloomed at different times of the year in one collection. So that's again a testament to the fact that he may have painted from real life, but he didn't just take a bunch of flowers and put them in the same basket. He would actually have to do this over time to show kind of all the seasons of a year and all the blooms in a single basket. So to me, that's very poetic, but also very interesting that he would have to study them during different months, during their different bloom times. And I also love the fact that we see petals on the table. So kind of a testament again to time and the expiration of flowers as they start to lose their form and shape. Mm-hmm. So this was a very interesting and really exciting discovery for me in the galleries, to learn about someone who had really dedicated to learning the form of, flowers and insects and rendering them accurately. As many people really just wanted to create something beautiful, he did something beautiful, but also with a really keen eye for realism.
So as a sort of counterpoint to Barrett and flower painting, just wanted to show you very quickly this beautiful botanical illustration by one of the great scientific botanical illustrators of all time, the Austrian artist Ferdinand Bauer. He and his brother Francis are two of the most celebrated botanical artists in history. This equally accurate to the Barrett, but really directed to a different end. And in this case, it's not only about the accuracy with which the piece is rendered, but also how readable it is in terms of enabling the viewer to be able to identify this species as found in the wild. And this is actually, this is the Iris germanicus. This is produced as a final illustration from pencil studies that were done by Bauer in the field. So this is actually a final piece based on an actual specimen that was rendered by Bauer in the wild. The goal of this is really identification. And as Kai was referencing earlier, you can see different parts of the plant here to enable a scientist or a medical man of the period to be able to identify this, probably for medicinal purposes. This piece, the engraving that was produced as, from this drawing, featured in a work called the Flora Greca, produced by a botanist of the 18th century named John Sibthorpe, who was retracing the steps of the ancient Greek physician Dioscorides. This was a goal to kind of record the plants of the area around the Mediterranean that played a role in medicine and pharmacology in the ancient world. And this was an attempt on the part of an 18th century botanist to retrace those steps and see what had been learned in the time in between. And with the botanist went the illustrator, and that was Bauer, produced these wonderful illustrations, of which this is a finished piece, equally accurate to the Barrett, but directed to a different end, serving a more explicitly scientific purpose, enabling identification in the field, or ultimately in a collection if this were pressed as an herbarium specimen or preserved in fluids as a spirit specimen. Back to the Rubens and the Barrett, we have these wonderful details in the work, and I'm going to turn it over to Kai for a second to identify some of the species and tell us some of the stories represented within.
And I'm just going to jump in. There was a question, did John Ringling collect botanical illustrations?
He did not, at least not that I'm aware of. Although interestingly, at the moment, in the Ringling's archive, are housed the 2,500 or so prints and roughly 500 rare botanical volumes from Selby Gardens collection. While Selby is going through their master planning phase, the Ringling has held those works for the last couple of months and will for the next year or so as part of our partnership. So there's the opportunity that you may see botanical illustration in the galleries or used for public programming through our partnership with Selby moving forward, but they're not a feature of the founding collection that resulted from John Ringling and his collecting practices in the 20s.
Yeah, so turning to the flowers that we see depicted, we're going to see tulips, daffodils, and roses. One of the roses I'd like to point out, it's the light pink one down on the right. Lovely, yes. So when we think about roses, we tend to think about Valentine's Day, you know, those high-centered roses that are very close together, very closed and cupped. But there's a lot of different types of roses, not just in their varieties, but also in how they present, so their phenotype, what they look like. So there are flat roses, which just have 5 petals, and then there's something like this, which is more I would classify it more as a globular rose that is very full. So there can be roses with 5 petals, and there can be roses with over 100 petals. So it's very neat to look at that single species, Rosa rosaceae, and see all of the differences that can kind of manifest, partially through human manipulation. You know, we took beautiful roses, we wanted a certain color, a certain scent, and we would breed them and hybridize them to create something new. But one of the ways that I was able to also recognize that this was a rose is if you look next to it, there is 5 leaves on that segment. And it's a little dark, it's a little hard to see, but on the bottom leaf, yeah, a little down, there's actually a dragonfly. And at first that escaped my notice, but what drew me to it is there's actually a little notch in that lowest leaf. And with the dragonfly right there, at first you would think that the dragonfly is actually eating that leaf, but dragonflies are pretty much strictly carnivorous. So they'll eat other insects, they'll even eat other dragonflies, which I have witnessed, and it's horrifying. It's very cool, but very terrifying. So when I look at that and see the warping of the leaf, you know, something had chewed at the leaf, my first thought is potentially that dragonfly is eating the pest that was eating that rose leaf. I'm actually very curious and don't necessarily have the answer, but I am curious if Barrett had the zoologic and entomological knowledge of, was that dragonfly eating the leaf or eating a pest? That'd be something I'd be very interested in knowing, because entomology often gets overlooked, but bugs and insects are very neat. In the lower left corner, oh, nope, excuse me. I'm gonna actually go up to the table where there's a white butterfly. So this, what really blew me away about this painting is how easy it was to identify some of the things in this. So this butterfly is called a cabbage white, and it is an extremely common cabbage pest in Europe. And that's actually a real life example. And this is actually a female of the species. They have 2 very prominent dots on their upper wings. The males actually, they have very small black dots, but they're almost imperceptible in this species. But that's a really neat thing that, you know, you look at the real life example and you look at Barrett's painting, they're very close and very scientifically accurate. One that we don't have a close-up in the picture, but it's one I recognized on site. One of my favorite species that you can also see in Florida is the red admiral butterfly. So this is one that's also in the painting. It is found in Europe as well as North America. You can find it in Florida. Really gorgeous colors on that one. And a neat fact about this is actually it was first described by Carl Linnaeus himself, the man responsible for the multiple naming system we have now. And it was first described in his book, I can remember the name off the top of my head. I'm not looking at notes. That was Systema Naturae. He had written other books as well, but that was the 10th edition of Systema Naturae that he had written. And that's when this species was first described. And there's a couple other species of butterflies that are in the painting. Those ones I had a bit more difficulty identifying, but those were the 2 that really jumped out and were just so beautifully rendered that they were incredibly easy to identify from it.
The last detail that we wanted to look at is this this vase with more beautiful flowers and again, if one looks closely, insects represented. But it's the tulips that we particularly wanted to draw your attention to. The painting from the second decade of the 17th century corresponds with the early years of what ultimately would become the tulip craze in the Netherlands. Tulips, they are native to Spain, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East. They were first really cultivated in Persia, and they are brought to cultivation for the first time in the Netherlands at the end of the 16th century through the efforts of a French horticulturalist named Carolus Clusius, who was growing tulips in his botanical garden at the University of Leiden. And it was from there that they ultimately were disseminated, and they became a very, very highly sought after commodity. The tulip craze of the early part of the 17th century is often referred to in economic terms as the first sort of economic bubble, because there's a speculative nature to this, which we'll get to in a second, but this became the subject of such a passion amongst collectors of the period that people were spending great fortunes, almost in some instances, kind of bankrupting themselves in their efforts to buy the most beautiful and the rarest examples. The Rolls Royce of tulips of the 17th century was this, the Semper Augustus. And Kai can help me here in a second. What's fascinating about this is the streaking that you can see in the petals, the red flares on the white ground. This is the result of really of a virus carried by aphids that affect the plant when it's a bulb. This was hugely desirable, and there are records from the 1630s of people spending extraordinary sums of money on a single bulb of this particular species. There is a record of a sale where a single bulb went for 5,500 guilders at that time, which is about $175,000 in today's terms. So you could buy a house, you could buy a Rolls Royce, or you could have a single bulb of the Semper Augustus. What's fascinating about this is that the person that shelled out that extraordinary sum of cash bought a plant that was in effect diseased and was already on the decline and is now extinct as a result of the weakening of the plant due to the virus that it carried, ultimately a process known as breaking. But it led to the extraordinary flaring on the petals, which made it so desirable as a commodity. Kai, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think you had touched on it, but it is very interesting that something that we found aesthetically beautiful, we didn't really understand at the time. You know, in the 1600s, we didn't know about viruses, we didn't know about viral transmission, and it wasn't actually identified and known as a virus until the 1920s. They were working on it. It was confirmed in the 1960s. So it took over 300 years to actually puzzle out that mystery of what caused that tulip breaking that was so incredibly valuable. And it is very funny to me that, you know, people would gamble the cost of a very nice house on this bulb. And they did it for something that was what we would later find out was diseased. So it speaks very to a really interesting phenomenon in human aesthetics and what we would later understand through biochemistry.
And as Kai is mentioning, there's an aspect of sort of speculativeness to this, that as a bulb, there was no way to be entirely sure of what you were actually going to get, that the plant that was produced would not always resemble exactly the parent plant from which it came. So there was a little bit of a rolling of the dice with this, which is truly fascinating. The same thing ultimately takes place in the 19th century with orchids. And in that case, it wasn't the sort of question of the coloring and the breaking that we described here through the impact of the virus, but it had to do with the fact that orchids couldn't be grown from seed, so it could only be collected in the wild. And this became a great craze amongst the Victorians, particularly in Britain and in other parts of Europe and in the United States. So again, people were shelling out extraordinary sums of money on plants because of their beauty and because of their rarity. And again, it was only in the early part and middle part of the 20th century that the science caught up with the craze, and there was the knowledge not only in terms of what was going on, but ultimately how to grow these in cultivation. Any questions?
There was a question in the chat about the identification of the larvae, the caterpillar on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Still looking into that one. I chose really the top two that I thought were amazing examples. The larvae are also a bit difficult to ID because some caterpillars, depending on what they eat, they will actually have different phenotypes. They'll look different. And one of my favorite examples of that is the cloudless sulfur. If it eats primarily the yellow leaves of the Senna genus, it'll be a beautiful bright yellow. If it mostly eats the green leaves, it'll be green. So it's also European based, so I have to consult different sources, but we're still looking into that one.
That'll be for a naturalist's guide to the return that we'll do when we're actually back in the galleries, hopefully in the near future.
And then there was just one more, just a confirmation, this tulip that you're showing now, David, that is now extinct. They're looking for confirmation on that.
Yes, this particular species is extinct, but there are now healthier hybridization methods that have that lead to a somewhat similar result in terms of the flaring in the petals, if I understand it correctly. Kai, is that right, as far as you know?
Yes, in my research, I was looking through about viruses. When we hear viruses, we tend to think, horrible, bad, catastrophic results, and that really can be the case. Some viruses can be ultimately harmless. Whether or not this went extinct as a result of the virus, it depends. Would have to consult a bit more on that. It could also just be that it just wasn't a good performer, whether or not it was the virus.
Right. And I think that there are certain now horticultural practices that would allow one genetically to kind of produce a plant that looks like this by a very different and probably healthier route, right?
I would think so, yeah.
Hopefully that answers the question. All right. So the next work that we wanted to focus on is this, which is undoubtedly very familiar to everybody, Wonderful Still Life with Parrots by Jan Davids de Heem from the 1640s. This, by one of the great sort of Dutch masters of the Golden Age, reflects these wonderful representations of nature here that are or were commodities of that period, brought back to the Netherlands from Dutch colonies around the world. So we want to focus for a minute on the kind of stemming from our discussion of the tulip on nature and economics. This very likely a piece that would have been commissioned by someone involved in trade, who was probably a very wealthy Dutch merchant, who would have adorned the walls of the home there with these sort of conspicuous representations of wealth being brought back as luxury goods from the various corners of the world. Still Life with Parrots gets its name from the two parrots that are in the top there. Right at the very top is an African gray parrot from West and Central Africa, kind of sparring with a scarlet macaw from Brazil. Before we delve into some of the details, one of the other features here, very prominently placed, is something that is recognizable to all of us, is the lobster, here represented as a luxury good, but as Kai can tell us, that was somewhat surprisingly not always the case.
Yeah, so one of my favorite tidbits of history actually revolves around the lobster. When we look at this painting that just exudes wealth, exudes luxury, painted around the 1640s, if we actually shift our geographic focus over to the area of Maine along the East Coast, lobster in what would later become the United States was not viewed favorably. So it was very abundant, and it was actually known as the poor man's protein. Because it was so abundant and easy to get, it wasn't valuable. And you would feed it to children, you would feed it to servants, because it wasn't viewed as a hot commodity, unlike what is being depicted in the painting here. It wasn't valued until around the 1880s when it was people began to serve it in diners in Boston and New York. And once that status was elevated, then the price actually started to pick up. So it's very neat to me that in a painting that just exudes luxury, value, you go a couple 100 miles and the same thing is not viewed as a valuable commodity, but rather as more of a quick meal.
Yeah, that connection between economy and geography is fascinating, and it does apply to a number of the other goods represented here as luxury items, but that's entirely based on the context in which they would have been collected, represented, and appreciated. In their native environments, infinitely more plentiful, and probably didn't draw the same, or may not have drawn the same level of attention. Examples might be here, these two beautiful shells, the two large shells. The one on the left is a turbo shell, and that on the right is a queen conch shell. These are the shells of two large sea snails. Kai, do you want to talk a little bit about the environmental connections to these?
Yeah, so when I look at this painting, I see three types of value. So lobsters directly ties to economic value, kind of that disparity between is it valuable or is it not. When I look at these shells, what I think about is personal value or sentimental value. So I'm a native Floridian. I see a conch shell. First thing you do is you put it to your ear and listen for the ocean. So that kind of personal connection to it, again, this was more of an economic perspective. But when I see this painting, I connect to it on a personal level, and also thinking about shells and where we are in the world right now, connecting it into the environment from whence it came. The ocean actually acts as a carbon sink. So excess CO2 in the environment gets absorbed into the ocean. Cool for our atmosphere, but not so cool for the ocean itself. That actually lowers the pH of the ocean, makes it more acidic, and it makes it more difficult for creatures who create these types of shells to obtain the materials they need, such as calcium carbonate. So these beautiful shells we see here, probably plentiful, easy for the creatures to create, is now shifting into a much more desperate environment to create those things. So again, drawing back to that personal, listening to the ocean and the seashell, and then thinking about how in the future shells may not be as plentiful.
One of the really enjoyable things, not only about developing, but about delivering this tour today in collaboration with my colleagues, is just the different perspectives that are brought. And mentioning before about my particular background as a historian, the thing to me that leaps to mind in looking particularly at the queen conch shell on the right is that it is this particular shell type that gave its name in the 17th century, most exactly at the time period represented in the painting, to the study of mollusks by shell type, what is today referred to and what in the 17th century was referred to as conchology, derived from this particular piece. And what's wonderful about this, and this became a craze within the kind of intellectual circles of the 17th century, is it was one of the ways in which the sort of scientifically minded of that period were trying to come to grips with the natural world, which through trade and global trade and exploration was expanding rapidly. So it was the study of things like this and what they represented that helped the individuals of this period who were engaged in this study and in the discourse that surrounded it. It's one of the ways in which they came to a better understanding of the world around them and ultimately their place within it. And it's great that with something as simple and as ubiquitous as this shell that we can all recognize, there is that wonderful story to unpack. Just to sort of wrap up our discussion with this particular piece, there are all these wonderful details. The lemons, for example, here are coming originally from Asia, and they would have been introduced to Europe via Italy. We have also, and I'll turn it over to Kai again, the oysters, which I'm sure many are a fan of. But as Kai will tell you, there are two sides to this particular mollusk.
Yeah, so oysters are filter feeders, so they actually take in water and they filter out the small particulates potentially small creatures. And that makes them really valuable for the environment. So that's kind of the third point of interest, third point of value I see when I look at this painting. A single oyster can actually filter 50 gallons of water each day. And so when you think about oyster reefs, which have hundreds, if not thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of oysters, you multiply that by 50 gallons per day, they provide a significant environmental benefit. And not only do they clean the water, but these oyster reefs, which, you don't really want to come into contact, they're very sharp. But because of that sharpness, because they're so densely packed and create kind of small niches for small fish, that makes them a great nursery space. So small fish and crabs can actually navigate these reefs and not get preyed upon by predators that are perhaps larger and cannot navigate those oyster environments as easily. So not only are oysters significant for how they clean our water, but they will actually protect, types of fish that will later become large and commercially beneficial. So people can go fishing and catch these large fish. But if we don't have nursery spaces that allow those smaller fish to, grow up and get larger, you really break up that life cycle, and it's going to trickle down and really harm, ecotourism, as well as the fishing and, folks who like to eat fish and crabs. It's going to ultimately come to that. So protecting nursery spaces through oyster reefs as well as mangroves is really, really key and important to especially Florida environments, but really anywhere that has an ocean connection or anywhere that has any type of lake or pond, really thinking about how do I keep this system intact. First, you have to protect the babies to make sure that, they can go on and grow up to serve that ecosystem.
Great. The last detail that we've got here is more of the sort of fruit on the table here. The pomegranate gets us to the Middle East, to Persia, and the melons to Asia and to Africa. And again, things that might have been plentiful in their native environments here represented as luxury goods on the table of a Dutch merchant in Haarlem or Amsterdam, Leiden, etc. The last thing to note would be this extraordinary piece of metalware here. The gold and silver represented in this work, the raw material is likely coming from the New World. It would be coming from most likely South America, brought back to Europe as a raw material and then fashioned into a manufactured good, which then would re-enter basically re-enter the economy as a desirable, saleable good, and ultimately end up as a finished piece on the table of the wealthy of that era as represented in the painting. So it's fun to kind of look at this wonderful composition and then break it down and think about the various items represented as commodities. But it doesn't, as Megan will explain, it doesn't end there. The same is true, again, when we think about nature as material, not just nature as subject.
Yeah, so the materials that are making up this painting are also imported from all over the world, really. With some materials that would have been processed or grown fairly locally, such as the linen canvas and the linseed oil are both coming from a flax plant. And really the best linen is grown in Belgium. So that would have been relatively local to Daheim. But when we look at the mineral materials being used, they're really imported from all over the world, because you can't just decide to grow a mineral in your backyard, right? You really have to go to where that mineral occurs naturally. So I have some actual physical examples to show you today. I'm going to start with ultramarine, which you're probably familiar with as a very, very valuable pigment. It's at the time of this painting, there's no synthetic ultramarine, so it's being made from crushed lapis lazuli. a mineral that was imported mainly from the area of modern-day Afghanistan. And the name itself, ultramarine, means beyond the sea, and it's a reference to it coming from beyond the sea. And we find that with a lot of pigments, actually, the names refer to the places where they're coming from. So I've got Verona green, which is a green earth, and that is coming from Verona, Italy, or that region. Got vermilion red, which is made from cinnabar, a mercury-rich mineral that's mainly mined in Spain. And still to this day, that the mines in Spain are big source of mercury. Chalk is fairly common throughout the world, but for artists, they really want the best quality material they can get, and the best quality chalk is coming from France, from the region of Champagne. So Champagne chalk is where it's at. I have Van Dyke brown, also called Castle Earth or Cologne Earth, because it's coming from that region in Germany. We have Venetian red, which is not actually sourced in Venice, but I think it's called Venetian red because so much of that pigment trade is coming through Venice. It's also referred to as Sinopia from Sinop, which is a region in Turkey where this iron oxide red would be mined. We have umber and sienna, which are also earth pigments. Umber from Umbria in Italy, sienna from Siena in Italy as well. And
There's
then
definitely a theme here, Megan.
yeah. And then a variety of earths. These are just ones that I happen to have in my collection. This is Rosso Sartorius, which is red earth from Sardinia. This is a French ochre, which is a yellow ochre is usually a much darker kind of mustardy yellow, but this is a really beautiful pale yellow. And then the last one, this is also an umber. It's a raw umber, but it's not from Umbria. It is actually from Cyprus, but it has this really lovely green tinge to it. So really you kind of have to go where the earth generates that way naturally to bring in these materials. And all these artist materials that are being imported from all over the world are being brought in on the same ships that are bringing the exotic fruits and the parrots and the raw metals, right? It's all coming in on the same ships from all over the earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the wonderful things about a painting like this, is to be able to kind of appreciate it for the beautiful final product that it is, but to also kind of unpack it and think about all the different aspects of history that are represented in not only the subjects depicted, but the materials used in its manufacture. Speaking of materials used in manufacture,
before we move on, can you go back? There was a question about where the second parrot is. If you could just point to that on the screen.
Yes. So unfortunately, I snapped these with my iPhone the last day I was in the galleries, trying to remember what it was we were going to talk about. So the green blob, or excuse me, the gray blob at the top here is the African gray parrot, which is facing towards us, so it's foreshortened, which is why it's a little harder to see. Nowhere near as easily identifiable as the scarlet macaw here seen in profile. So we have the African gray from Central and West Africa, and then here is the scarlet macaw from Brazil. All right. So from parrots to cabinets of curiosities. This is a collector's cabinet, probably familiar to those of you who have walked the galleries in the recent past. Flemish, most likely made in the city of Antwerp in the early part of the 1600s. This is a small cabinet in which a collector would have stored small, precious, valuable things. And the term in German is Wunderkammer or Kunstkammer for art cabinet, refers originally to these actual pieces of furniture, but then in time is applied to whole rooms and suites of rooms in which the great and good kept their collections, And these, in a slightly oversimplified way, become the kind of precursors to modern day museums. So think about it as a museum you can take with you and unpack on your travels. This depicts, has these small scenes taken from the Old Testament. This is attributed to the Flemish painter Franz Franken II. But it's not really the panels that are our interest, it's the materials out of which this is made. We have ebonized wood, so this is wood that's treated to kind of mimic ebony, the dark wood that would be coming from the tropics of, well, it would be parts of India and Sri Lanka, from Indonesia, as well as from places like Mauritius that the Dutch used as a stopping off point as they were coming back from Jakarta, coming from the east back to Europe. So ebonized wood, we've got ivory here in the little checkerboard floor of this central chamber. Luxury goods that are intended to kind of heighten the beauty of cabinets like this, but they are an extension of that sense of this as a cabinet of curiosities. The materials themselves are part of what is curious about them. At the top of that list, at least from our perspective, is what is used as a veneer here around the drawers, and that is tortoiseshell. Kai, do you want to introduce that as a subject?
Yeah. So tortoiseshell was very popular from the 18th to early 20th centuries, and like the name indicates, it was sourced from turtles. The most popular turtle it was sourced from was the hawksbill sea turtle, as seen right there. And the material would actually be taken from the top shell. So that's called, here's your $10 word for the day, called the carapace. And you see on the hawksbill how beautiful those contrasting colors are. It was also taken from other turtles and tortoises. The second most popular was the green turtle, but by far the hawksbill was favored due to how beautiful those contrasting colors on the carapace were. Due to the way they were harvested, to this day, this species is actually still critically endangered. But thanks to CITES, in 1977, the trade and harvesting of these turtles was banned.
And CITES was the international convention, right, on the trade in endangered species?
Yes, it's the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna. So there's your mouthful.
Yes.
But CITES for short. Yes.
For sure. So if an artist, or more likely the artist's patron, could afford the embellishment of something like a tortoise shell veneer, they would likely draw the material from the hawksbill. But we have examples in the collection actually hanging in the gallery near to the cabinet that show alternatives. If either the material were not available or it couldn't be afforded, there were other options out there to produce a similar effect. Megan, will you talk us through those?
Yeah, so tortoiseshell, depending on the species of turtle that it comes from, they will have different colors and different patterns. So the hawksbill is the most popular and sort of considered the most beautiful, but we see different varieties as well used in artwork. And the material is fairly translucent, and it's hygroscopic and thermoplastic, which means if you boil it in water, you can actually change its shape. And you see on this frame, it's been applied to follow the molding, the edge of the frame. And there are other materials that do this too. For example, horn. So horn can be boiled and shaved down and molded to different shapes in very much the same way. And it was probably the most common and the most convincing way to make an imitation tortoise shell. It could be colored or dyed to imitate the color patterns. And really, unless you take a sample and look at it under a microscope with a transmitted light, it's very, very difficult to tell just by looking at the surface whether you have a horn imitation or whether you have true tortoise shell. So on this frame in particular, We see some color variation in the center of the top and bottom members. There's an area there that's a little more reddish. And this could be because we are seeing tortoise shell coming from different species. This could be because there's actually a different color painted underneath in those sections. Tortoise shell is fairly translucent, so if there's a bright color painted underneath, you'll actually see that come through. Or it could be because part of it is replacement and is faux tortoise shell, possibly. Without taking a sample from this frame, we can't really tell. And of course, we don't want to damage the frame. So we're just going to live with the uncertainty and enjoy it for its own beauty.
We'll call it the mystery as opposed to
mystery. And of course, there's a much cheaper and faster way of making imitation tortoise shell, and that would be just to paint it, as we see on this frame. So even though this probably wouldn't be fooling anybody, that aesthetic is so sought after that even a painted imitation of the tortoise shell is something that would be valued, that would be, you know, desirable in an object.
Great. So we've got really the work of two more artists that we're going to look at quickly here as we wrap up. Both French 19th century artists. The first is the great animalier sculptor Antoine-Louis Barye. The Ringling has this small bronze of a tiger attacking an antelope. And it's indicative of the kind of work for which the artist became famous in the 19th century and continues to be well known and associated today. Barye, together with the other artists we're going to look at in a second, Rosa Bonheur, are two artists of the 19th century that really helped to elevate the status of the animal as a subject worthy of interest in the fine arts, as a subject in and of itself, as opposed to an adjunct to something else. And they both exhibited their work at the Paris Salon and were very well received for their efforts. They also both share a background in animal anatomy and in kind of the observation that any good naturalist would admire in their colleagues. Barye had access to wild animals at the menagerie in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. This is the former Royal Botanical Garden. This is wonderful because ultimately one of Barye's direct contemporaries, a French art critic of the period, refers to him ultimately as the Michelangelo of the menagerie. So that connection with actual living animals first produced in detailed studies in the menagerie in Paris informs the artist's work. But as you can see here, unlike the animals that were represented in the Cranach, which looked less natural and maybe more emblematic, there is a deep knowledge of animal anatomy represented here, but yet there is still a degree of fantasy in the extraordinary interaction between predator and prey. And like Michelangelo, there's definitely a celebration of the musculature and the rendering of the musculature in these animals, just as Michelangelo would do in his rendering of the human form in the Renaissance. Barye ultimately, as I mentioned, produced detailed sketches from life and ultimately animals in death at the Royal Botanical Gardens, the menagerie there. And in 1854, as his reputation as an artist and as an animalier artist is on the rise in France, he is appointed Master of Zoological Drawing at the Natural History Museum in Paris, and he held that position from 1854 until his death. So he had access to animals drawn from life, but also engaged in the dissection of animals as part of the preparation of specimens at the museum. So had access to the material, and through that access developed a deep knowledge of animal anatomy that is very clearly reflected in works of which this would be a very fine example. This is a sketch at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore by Barye of a lioness at the menagerie in the Jardin des Plantes. This was a lioness that was part of two lions that were donated to the menagerie in 1828. And unfortunately, the lioness died in captivity. But you can see here in the details the view of the head from above, as well as the animal in profile, with the lines that reflect the very careful rendering and the sort of scientific exactitude with which this was drawn. What's wonderful, just like with Leonardo in his anatomical drawings of centuries before, it's applying some of the basics of architectural draftsmanship to the study of anatomy. But it's through that process that the artist develops the detailed knowledge of animal anatomy that was reflected in the sculpture. And as mentioned, from Barrett to his contemporary Rosa Bonheur, the Ringling is fortunate to have two wonderful paintings by Bonheur in the collection. Probably the best known is this wonderful agricultural scene, plowing in the Nivernais. This is the agricultural region of central France surrounding the city of Nevers. Rosa Bonheur spent most of her professional life in and around Paris. She sketched animals in the pastures outside the city, and she gets involved in and becomes intimately acquainted with animal anatomy in the slaughterhouses of the city, and then is engaged in dissections of animals at the National Veterinary Institute in Maison Delfort, just in the suburbs of the city. So she too, like Barrett, develops this detailed knowledge of animal anatomy that is represented here. These are animals that are represented with a much higher level of scientific accuracy, detail and accuracy than we saw in the reflection or as reflected in the work by Cranach earlier. And a lot of that is a direct reflection of access and observation. So from this painting of plowing in the Nivernais, as many of you are familiar, if you've been to the Ringling recently, in the beautifully reinstalled Gallery 21, directly opposite that painting is this, a family of deer out in the forest at Fontainebleau, another painting by Rosa Bonheur. And this is the painting with which Megan will bring us to a close today.
Yes, and well, these two are probably two of my very favorite paintings in the whole collection. I'm actually going to talk about the frame, not the painting. And with this frame, the frame on the Nivernais is perhaps more spectacular, but this frame has some good examples of all of these different techniques that were used for frame making that I'm going to just run through a little bit now. So much like with the Cranach panel painting that we saw at the beginning of the talk, the first step in preparing this wooden surface for the frame would be to apply a dilute size, a very diluted animal glue coating, and then after that, a gesso coating, which again, gesso would be animal glue mixed with some sort of whiting, a chalk or a gypsum or something like that. So here we see some animal glue. On the left is the dry animal glue, and this is just one of the many forms you might find dry animal glue in. And then on the right is the animal glue in solution in water. And this is actually a very concentrated solution. If you were going to use it to actually apply it to a surface for a sizing, like I'm discussing, it would be very, very dilute. It would be a thin broth of sorts that you could brush on easily. So after applying several layers of the gesso, which would be sanded between each layering and creating a really smooth surface, you'd apply a bowl. David, if you can hit the next slide. Thank you. So bowl is a kind of clay material, and clays, I don't know if you're familiar, but clay is made out of kind of plate-like little particles, which actually will lay flat, that they compress, and that's what gives clay its modeling properties. So this would be applied, mixed with animal glue again, and brushed on in several layers and sanded to get a really, really smooth surface, which would then, you'd put your gold leaf on, David, thank you. So the gold leaf application is the trickiest part by far out of this whole process. Gold leaf is really, really thin. It's just gold that's been pounded down to very, very thin material. It flutters away with your breath alone. If you touch it, it basically falls apart. So it's a tricky material to work with. And this would be applied to the bowl by first wetting the bowl with what's called gilder's liquor. And it does contain alcohol. It would be mostly water and a little bit of alcohol and a little bit of animal glue again. And then the gold leaf is applied and it's allowed to dry a little bit, but not completely bone dry. So while there's still a little bit of moisture in that clay bowl underneath, you can take a burnisher, usually a really polished agate stone, and burnish the surface. And what that does is it actually lays down those little platelets in the clay below the gold. So you're actually burnishing the bowl, not the gold itself. But that's what creates that really high shine, metallic, smooth surface that you see on gilded objects. So David, if we can go back to the frame. So the very interior edge, and David, can you point it out with the mouse maybe? Mm-hmm. So that surface, you can see kind of a reflection on that bottom edge. That's water gilded. That's a really smooth, high shine, metallic kind of surface. But then in the 19th century, we start seeing kind of innovative materials and techniques for decorating frames. So if you go in from the inside edge, the next flat surface you see is actually sanded. So there's actually sand on the surface below the gilding, and it looks like sand. It gives it an interesting texture, and it plays with the light a little differently. And this is where I really miss being in the galleries, because I know it's really hard to see this in a photograph. You really need to move around and see how the light changes as you move. But if you tried to burnish a sanded surface like that, a rough surface, you would just break up the gold leaf. It doesn't work. So instead of using a bowl for that surface, that's actually done with oil gilding. So it is an oil-based varnish with some metallic salts in it. And then the gold leaf is kind of tamped on top of that. It's more like glitter painting than gilding. It's a very different type of technique and much more forgiving. And then the ornament that you see, all the kind of curlicue, floral, ornamental parts on the other parts of the frame, that's not carved. That's actually an applied ornament. And that's made with a material called compo, which is short for composition, but it's actually more commonly known as compo. And that is actually a material that is made out of all three of our categories today: animal, vegetable, and mineral. So it's, if anyone can guess, it is made out of animal glue again. And because when animal glue cools, it turns kind of like a gelatin. It gets, kind of jelly. When this material cools, it actually has that same effect. It's kind of funny jelly material. But while it's warm, it's very pliable, kind of like a modeling clay, like Play-Doh or something like that. So if you work with it warm, you can shape it and press it into molds to make decorations like you see on this frame. Then we have some vegetable components to this material. There's linseed oil in it. There's rosin, which is a resin that comes from a tree, and glycerin as well. And then finally mineral, they would add gypsum or chalk or some whiting as well to give it some color and some bulk. So I actually have a little example of compo, and this is the compo alone with no coating, no gilding, nothing on the surface. And we made this in graduate school, and we pressed it into little molds. But it's very, very stiff. It's very resilient. I mean, I broke it. But it's quite brittle and hard. So once it dries completely, it's a very resilient surface that then you can apply your gold leaf to. So it's a really
cheap, economical way to make these really ornate frames, and very reproducible, very fast. So that brings us full circle. Any final questions?
Yes, thank you, Megan. I'm gonna quickly shift from sharing the screen to seeing you all, because I think that'll be easier in terms of engaging in a conversation here. And I can also open the chat feature to see what questions there might be. But that sort of brings us to the end of our formal talk, such as it is. I thank you for participating. We'll be happy to answer questions, but I would encourage you, as we have tried to do today, that when you are next in the galleries, and I look forward to the time when we can welcome you on site, to look at the works on display through different lenses, and perhaps ask slightly different questions about the collection, because it opens up a whole other aspect of history and the history of art that is maybe a little less expected, but can be equally, if not in some ways, more fun, which hopefully we illustrated today. But if you have any questions and would like to unmute yourselves, you are welcome to do so, and we'll happily try to answer whatever questions you've got.
Not a question, just a thank you to you all, especially the horticultural part, because I'm a horticulturist and I loved Kai's input on this. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Again, thank you all. I'm a volunteer with family programs, so I love some of the insights because we could share them with the children, especially some of the older boys. Sometimes it's hard to engage them, but I think talking about the dragonfly and some other things would be wonderful, and making the paints and the minerals. Thank you all very much.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, if not, then I guess it just leaves it to thank you again for your participation, and we hope that you take care and stay safe, and hopefully in the not too distant future we can welcome you back on site and lead you through the galleries to explore more of the nature on display, but also the other subjects that are represented in the galleries. So this was great fun. Thank you for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.